when I went into recovery, when I went into rehab, I actually didn't think I could get sober. And, I had been using for 20 years. I had basically been shooting meth for most of 15. And I thought that the best I could do was to go in and try to figure out how to use less, because that would mean my life was less chaotic. And it's not that I wanted to keep going. It was just literally beyond my imagination to think about stopping. But with time, as I saw other examples of people who had done it, and as you say, they were, 6 months or a year or 2 years sober, and they've got a job and they're paying off their back taxes and they look, healthy and productive. And that sort of started to give me a reassurance that maybe it was on the table for me. And so therefore I should make the effort, to get what they have.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift. So many of us are moved to write books or create other works of art because of a traumatic life experience that we've suffered through. But when those experiences also carry a stigma, it can be tough to navigate the feelings of shame, self-protection, and privacy issues that come up. How do you free yourself to share your story when you're worried that it might affect your reputation or your career? My guest today knows all about it, and she's here to share her insights. Mary Beth O'Connor is an addiction recovery advocate who's been clean and sober for nearly 30 years. But in her teens and young adulthood, Mary Beth was addicted to methamphetamines, shooting up daily for years. It nearly destroyed her life. Yet after getting clean, she put herself through law school, became a lawyer, and eventually a federal judge. She chronicles her journey and offers hope to others seeking to break free from addiction and level up their lives in her memoir, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. Mary Beth, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm actually on my own substance abuse recovery journey. I gave up alcohol over 2.5 years ago, and my life has just been, it's never been better. I think that what I didn't realize was, I think when I was struggling to control my drinking and then to break free from my drinking, my focus was really on what it was costing me and trying to limit the damages. But what I couldn't know then was just how large and amazing the potential upside was on the other side of giving up alcohol. So, and that's clearly been true for you. I mean, you went on to do incredible things.
Yeah, I mean, like you, when I went into recovery, when I went into rehab, I actually didn't think I could get sober. I had been using for 20 years. I had basically been shooting meth for most of 15. And I thought that the best I could do was to go in and try to figure out how to use less, because that would mean my life was less chaotic. And it's not that I wanted to keep going. It was just literally beyond my imagination to think about stopping. But with time, as I saw other examples of people who had done it, and as you say, they were, 6 months or a year or 2 years sober, and they've got a job and they're paying off their back taxes and they look, healthy and productive. And that sort of started to give me a reassurance that maybe it was on the table for me. And so therefore I should make the effort, to get what they have.
Wonderful. Yeah. Remarkable. And it does take so much courage and vision in order to kind of walk through that gateway and find yourself on the other side.
Yeah. Although I will say, I think sometimes we have this fantasy that everyone walks in the room like 100% sure they want to be sober, 100% committed. And in my experience, that's not true for most of us. And so I really want to make anyone who's considering sobriety, reassure them that it's okay to walk in ambivalent. Most of us walk in ambivalent. And it's only over time, as we start to sort of absorb that the possibilities, start to do the work, see some initial successes, that we get that it strengthens our resolve and our commitment. So don't let ambivalence stand in your way. Walk in the rooms anyway and start on your path.
Right, because once you start to see the reward, that reward becomes infinitely more appealing than the so-called reward of, getting inebriated.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that the message that I remember, I had a lot of internal self-talk around it. There was lots and lots of inner conversation about it. But the thing that I told myself that wound up being for me, the thing that kind of pushed me over the edge into, having the resolve to really make serious efforts toward getting sober, was that I knew who I was when I was drinking. I knew the drinking me very well, and I'd had that experience, pretty much the same damn experience every single time. I'd had it enough times, but I didn't know who I could be without it. And I wanted to find out and meet that person.
You see, that's a great motivator. It's interesting because one of my techniques in early recovery was to think back to who I had been, not really just before the drugs, but before the abuse, because, who was sort of my original self? Because I
Mm.
thought, she's still in there somewhere. And if I could reconnect to her, that would be one area in which I could sort of strengthen my own foundation, right? If I could get back to who I had originally been, that would help me move forward. And so I thought about that consciously and really made efforts to do that.
Yeah. And in your case, the abuse started young, and we're going to get into your actual story in a little bit. I also want to talk about your experience writing the book and sharing the book. But first, I'd love to know more about your work today. So you're retired from your work as a federal judge. You now, you're involved in the She Recovers Foundation and Life Ring Cellular Recovery. No, Secular Recovery. Tell me about those organizations and your work with them.
Yeah, so I'm on the board for LifeRing Secular Recovery, and LifeRing is a peer support group, and we have a foundation that's not based on a higher power the way 12 Steps is. It's really focused on self-empowerment, but also sobriety, although for us, sobriety includes medication to assist with sobriety. And it's just secular, as in no religion in the meetings, but a lot of people have individual spiritual or religious beliefs, and LifeRing doesn't have any opinion about that. But we focus on building up your own motivation, your own skills, and strengthen your ability to make positive choices to build up. We call it building up the sober self. And
Amazing.
that's the way to move forward. And then She Recovers Foundation, which I'm on the board for, isn't just recovery from substances. It's actually also recovery from trauma, from mental health, from behavioral disorders like eating disorders or gambling, self-harm, overwork. It's for everything, because most of us with a substance use disorder have one or more of those other areas that we also need to work on. And
I mean,
so
I think
it's
most
sort
of us, whether or not we have a substance use disorder, have those things to work, one or more of those things to work on. Yeah.
That's right. And 20% of She Recovers members actually don't have a substance use disorder. They're there for other reasons, but it's a place where you don't sort of have to silo out. Over here, I talk about my eating disorder, and over here, I talk about my substances. It's all together because the recovery, there's an interplay, there's an overlap in the recovery, or there can be challenges. Like if you have a anxiety, that can make it harder to get your sobriety under control because you're stressing or whatever it might be. Because of that overlap, everything's on the table and She Recovers, and we can talk about it all as sort of a holistic whole.
And is that also a peer support group, or is that a different kind of provider of services?
So it is peer support. We have meetings every day, but it also has retreats and foundation and conferences. And there are speakers, like we have Mental Health Mondays where they'll have a speaker a week. They have a podcast. So it's multiple approaches to helping women get their recovery, strengthen their recovery.
Amazing. So we will, for anyone listening who is curious about more, we will link to those organizations in the show notes too. Mary Beth, I'm curious about what this issue means to you, and has this really kind of become this central focus of what you consider to be your life's work and your role on the planet?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was working, it's hard to really be out about your recovery. People have, and I had, valid professional consequences concerns, and also I just didn't feel it was relevant. But when I was looking at retiring, and I do always emphasize early retirement.
Yeah.
I felt like it was my opportunity to really be of service in a way I hadn't been before. And so I joined the board for LifeRing several years before I retired, but I was working on my book, and I was starting to write opinion pieces to get placed, which the first one came out not long after I retired. So I do view this as sort of my part-time retirement job is to be of service where I can, to be part of the conversation, to get people to inform people about the issues that I think are important for them to learn about, for society to better appreciate, like the trauma substance use connection. And it is so. Yes, it's my time to be of use at this point, and that's really how I spend a large chunk of my retirement energy is on that.
Your early retirement, right? Yeah,
that's right.
And I mean, let's just look at that a little bit more closely. Why this issue? Why is this issue so important to you?
So, I mean, a couple things. One is that I do feel like there's a stigma, right? I mean, think about, I called my book Junkie, right? Which is because I really wanted to own the intravenous use side of my addiction and the meth side. Partly it's when I see on television where they have people who are struggling with methamphetamine and they're shooting up. They show them in these, horrid living circumstances. They present them almost as if they're sort of so far gone that they're like beyond our empathy, beyond our understanding. And
because it really kind of strips the humanity from them, those kind of depictions, and that
maybe the
perspective.
It strips them living a happy life, but I would hope that we all see the humanity in that, right? That it is somebody who is clearly struggling. It's not as if they're having a good time or they're living in a happy place. I mean, it's a miserable existence, and that choice is being made for a reason, that if we dug underneath it, we might actually be able to understand how they ended up where they are. And
yeah,
so
and
I do.
Just to clarify, what I meant was the perspective on people who are going through that experience, that perspective that they're beyond hope, or that those extreme visions or images of addiction. That is what I meant. Sort of like removes our sense of that individual's humanity.
Exactly. It's like almost like they're presented like they're something in a zoo. I mean, it's not as if they're not real people with real feelings, with real stories, with real histories, deserving of our efforts to help them find a way forward. And so,
and with real potential.
Yes, exactly. I mean, in recovery, who knows who they could be in their recovery? We don't know. But you and I know they're going to be in a very different than they are today in the middle of their active meth use disorder, right? They're going to be a different person living a different life. And I just want them to have that opportunity. So I thought, because of the unusual arc to have gone from shooting meth to judge, using those words from junkie to judge is a way to show in a couple words that in recovery, we can be anything, right? Anything is possible. So let's not give up. So that was part of it. But it is also that stigma reduction. I felt like as a former judge, if someone saw that someone who used to shoot meth became a judge, maybe they would think about it a little bit more. Think about the judgments they can give on someone who succumbs to an addiction, a substance use disorder, to maybe humanize it a little bit more and reduce that stigma. And so there were those reasons. But it's also because I wanted to make people more aware of the secular options of the peer support groups beyond just 12 steps. I mean, a lot of people do well in 12 steps, but a lot of people don't. And so a lot of what I talk about is multiple pathways, so that people can know what their choices are and find the right fit, and that'll increase their odds of success. Because ultimately that's what I want to do my part to help more people find successful sobriety.
And let's just follow that to its conclusion. Why is it important to help people find sobriety? Why is it important to reduce stigma? I sense that there's something here about just bringing more people into a joyful, expansive life, or recovering their potential.
Right. And it's also because I remember the misery of it, right? I mean, I have 29 years, but I have not forgotten how miserable that existence was. And so my heart goes out to anyone still struggling in that place. And I don't want anyone to have to suffer through that longer than necessary. And the other reality is that we don't have a good system in America we do not have affordable, readily accessible treatment programs, right, for everybody. And yet we act as if we do. There's sort of, to me, part of the judgmentalism is based on the assumption that anybody could get help who wants it. That's just really not true in America. Well, and so I try to talk about things like that as well.
And I'm curious about, you mentioned op-eds a little minute ago, and access to support tools. Some might say, well, what are you talking about? AA is free and anybody can join. So let's just connect the dots here. That first, I don't know if it was your first op-ed, but possibly the highest profile one was published by the Wall Street Journal, with the provocative title, "I Beat Addiction Without God." So, let's talk about AA, the higher power part. Why are people surprised that you can beat addiction without God? I know that you identify as an atheist. Let's talk about that whole ball of yarn.
Yeah, and so the reality is that all of the peer support groups basically work equally effectively. There was a study done, it's called the Peer Alternative Study, and it compared AA and LifeRing and SMART and Women for Sobriety and found they're all equally effective. But they're not all the right fit for everyone. I would never say that LifeRing is right for everyone or She Recovers is right for everyone. None of them are right for everyone. They have different philosophies, but also different meeting formats. And so some people, for example, in 12 steps, there's a speaker who talks for 20 minutes or more of the meeting. Well, in life, we don't have that. So the entire meeting is people sharing. In life, we have crosstalk, and 12 steps doesn't. So there are a lot of differences. And the other thing I'll say is that some atheists and agnostics make 12 steps work, and there were a lot of faith-based people in the secular options because not everyone likes the powerless idea. Not everyone likes having a sponsor. Not everyone likes the focus on defects. So there's multiple reasons why someone might choose a different program. In addition to the higher power is an obstacle for a lot of people as far as 12 steps goes. But if they, look up their options, there's a place, I think, for everyone. It's just a matter of knowing that there are choices on the table so you can do the research and find the right fit.
And I really relate to that. The AA, I think the AA, the 12-step framework has so much tremendous value in it. The accountability and the all of the steps themselves, I think have in many ways they kind of echo what psychology knows about a sort of journey of self empowerment and accountability that is liberating and leads to personal fulfillment and happiness. But for me, I also, I consider myself a spiritual person. I have a spiritual practice. I do believe in, I don't call it a higher power, but I don't identify as an atheist. However, the religious aspect or, certainly the emphasis on brokenness or powerlessness was a super big turnoff for me for AA, and I got sober without AA. So I agree. I think that multiple paths are needed so that these things can meet people where they are. So how did you actually do it? What were your practical recovery steps?
So when I went into rehab in 93, they actually told me 12 steps was the only thing that existed. And so at first I tried to find a way to sort of reframe it and take parts of it and use what I could and just, ignore the parts that didn't fit, which was a lot of the basic fundamental ideas. But I read all the big book. I read all the NA text to look for parts I could use. But then I got home and I emphasized for younger people, there was no Google. Okay. So I went to the library to see if there were alternatives. And even in 1994, there were alternatives. So for me, Women for Sobriety existed. They're the first modern option to 12 steps. And I found, them in the library. I got their book. I went to their meetings. I found Rational Recovery, which exists a little today, but mostly has evolved into Smart Recovery. And I found SOS, Secular Organization for Sobriety, which exists a little, but mostly is LifeRing. And so what I did was I read all the materials for all of them. I went to meetings for all of them. And I just continued to synthesize it, pull the parts I thought would help me. And I didn't know anyone else who did it at that time, but today more people do that. LifeRing would call it a personal recovery plan, or it's also called a hybrid or a patchwork plan where you use more than one program to build your foundation. So that's what I did. I patchworked it before the term existed.
Amazing. And then once you became sober, it wasn't just sort of like, okay, I'm going to get a job. You actually pursued a very ambitious career path, put yourself through law school, became a lawyer, and then a federal judge. What? How did you find, what's the word? Like the gumption to aim so high after having been down so low?
Well, it was really step by step. I mean, when I got sober at 32, I mean, I was 32 years old. I had worked my way, my term is I worked my way down the corporate ladder, right? Because I couldn't hold a job because I was using drugs. So when I got sober, my resume was an embarrassment. I had a Berkeley degree and good grades and an embarrassing resume. So my first job was actually a part-time, temporary, low-level admin job because for me to like get up every day and go to work on time and stay all the hours and do a good job and do it tomorrow and the next day and the next, I was 32 and I had never done it.
When you
So
say
I
your
needed
first
to,
job, you mean your first sober job?
my first sober
Uh-huh.
job when I got
Okay.
back from rehab. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I needed to sort of get the practice of doing that. You know what I mean? To have
Mm-hmm.
it become that habit. And then my second job was a full-time permanent mid-level administrative job. And then I got a supervisory job at a larger company and got a promotion. And then at 6.5 years sober, I went to law school. And at
Mm-hmm.
20 years sober, I was a federal judge. So it's not like I got sober and said, I'm going to be a judge. You know, it was
Yeah.
really about what's the right next step for me. And then when I get the next job, how do I prepare myself for the job I want after that? And so it was always one, you know, one step, next step, next step. It was not a 20-year plan when I got sober that I was going to get appointed a federal judge, not in any way. It was just always about, I want to keep growing. I want to keep moving forward. And eventually that's where it led me.
This is what's so wild about, stepping out of the shackles of addiction is, really, like I think, as I was saying earlier, just meeting that person that you really are and encountering your own unfiltered, undiluted potential, sort of watching it build and build and build. There just isn't, a limit to what you can do with it, with yourself.
That, that's right. I mean, it's, you know, I think sometimes in early recovery, people are over encouraged to think about like their 5-year plan. I think in the beginning in particular, it's really important to focus on what are my first goals. You know,
Mm.
for me, I had broken so much of my life. I had a list of things I had to fix and I couldn't even work on them all in the beginning. The list was too long. I had to prioritize. And so I think in the early days in particular, it's important to really focus on what are my priorities and what's step one in each of my priority areas, and then build up from there. Because first of
Mm-hmm.
all, I don't think there's a real way to know in the beginning of recovery what you're going to want in 2 or 5 years, because you're going to be a very different person in those 2 or 5 years because of your recovery. And so let's focus on building ourselves up during that initial period and then make the big decisions about where we want to go long term.
Beautiful advice. I love that. So let's talk about the book itself. Can you tell us a bit about your story and how the book is structured? Like, what is the journey that the book itself takes us on?
So when I was appointed a judge, it was sort of like a natural reflection time, and I started thinking about the book. But I had actually not really read memoir. I had read like 2 in my whole life, and so I started reading them. And what I realized was, oh my gosh, it's written like a novel. I don't have the skill set to do this, right? And so I did start taking notes, but I also started taking classes. I took, classes on memoir writing, but also just fiction, how to write a scene, how to do dialogue, how to get emotion in, and make people feel connected to the characters. So I did all of those things for a number of years. But the other thing is, when I looked at the structure of the memoirs I read, I decided to do it a little different. I felt that a lot of the memoirs, sort of the recovery memoirs in particular, they sort of leap into the craziness of the drug use, and they didn't show the context. And so I wanted to show why it made sense for me to pick up alcohol at 12 and move on to shooting meth by 17. And so that means I included my family history and the trauma, the family dynamics and the trauma. I mean, there's some funny stories about my sister and I to break up, the stress of it. But
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I wanted to show why those choices about drugs made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do have, the chaos of using and all that. But I've also felt that at the end, most memoirs are sort of like, I went to a couple meetings and everything was great. And well, that's not how recovery works. And so I covered the first 3 years of my sobriety, which I felt was important for 2 reasons. One, three, I guess, is more accurate. But also I had to do the trauma recovery at the same time, which a lot of people have to do. But also I did do it a more individual way. And so I thought it was important to show how I did it. What was my analysis? What what was I balancing and weighing in the choices I was making, so that people that are thinking about looking at alternative approaches would have at least one example of someone who had done that in the memoir space.
I really love that you approached it from a novelistic standpoint, because I think a lot of people who are new to memoir and what is most pressing for them is the impact of the experiences that they've had, and they think that, well, if I simply just lay these experiences out on the table and just explain, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, then that will make for an engaging read, and that's just not how great memoirs are written.
That's right. I mean, I really did spend a lot of time on the writing. I knew I had a story, but it was really about what's the right structure and how do I write this to the best of my ability. I mean, what was really helpful was that I was sort of humble enough to admit to myself, I mean, I was a great legal writer, but that's a different skill set than this. And I need
Very.
to find out from the experts, And so that's what I did. And I did win a Silver Nonfiction Book Awards this year, which made me very happy.
Congratulations.
Yes, and the Librarians of America, they gave me a recommendation, and my favorite phrase was they said it was page-turning prose. And I thought, well, if the Librarians of America think it's page-turning prose, I guess all that hard work on the writing paid off.
They should know. Well, so where did you study? Did you take local classes at local community college, or was there a national writing group, or where did you learn this?
So it was a combination. I took a 6-month class through the National Association of Memoir Writers, which they do still offer. And then I'm near San Francisco, and they have two really strong writing organizations there, the Writers Salon and the Writers Grotto. And then I took a couple classes at Stanford on writing as well. So it was a combination of things.
What do you think changed what was the biggest impact, or change in you in terms of your writing from when you first sat down to start exploring to when the book was published? How did you develop your skill?
It was to get the emotion on the page. It was to make it more, to really go deeper and to really think about, what I was feeling, to get into the details. I mean, they had this technique where you close your eyes and visualize that you're in the room, and I would use that. But the hard part for me was getting the emotion on the page. I tend to be analytical. I actually did an emotions pass on the book. I went through the entire book and just made sure, do I have the emotions there that the reader needs to feel connected and to understand me? So that was the biggest challenge, because it's very different. That's the opposite of legal writing, right?
Absolutely. You take the emotion out. Yeah. And how did you deal with chronology? It sounds like you were blending material from childhood, from early adulthood. Like you really your story covers a lot of years in your personal timeline. Did you plot them all out chronologically, or did you, go up and down from future to past and back again?
So the book is basically chronological, except chapter 1 is the first time that I shot meth. But after that, it's mostly chronological.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd love to know a little bit about the writing process for you. How did you said actually in our questionnaire before this interview that you wrote in 30 to 60-minute chunks. I don't understand that. I could never do that. It takes me 30 minutes just to sort of stop squirming in my seat and start writing. How did you manage that?
Well, I mean, I started this when I was a new judge, right? So I had a full-time job that was pretty demanding. And so I really had to find a way to do the writing around that. And for me, I tend to approach big tasks in small chunks. In general, I like to break things down and, make sure, okay, well, here's task 1, do that, task 2, do that. And eventually the project gets complete. And so for me, it was really thinking about how can I get the writing around my work and around the rest of my life. And so generally speaking, I would work on it in the mornings, 30 to 90 minutes, 5 days a week is what I ended up landing on. And then sometimes I would have a class all weekend or, one night a week for a couple of weeks. It might be bigger. But in general, I worked on it for 30 to 90 minutes a day for 5 days a week.
And how long did that take?
Took me 7 years because
wow, that makes sense.
Yes.
7 years for the initial. Was that the initial draft or the whole thing? Uh-huh.
Done
So
7 years until I started looking for an agent. So 7 years until it was as done, as I could make it done. But it was really more like a hobby. But I wanted to never stop working on it because you know how it is with you get a momentum going, and I was worried if I put it aside, I wouldn't pick it back up again. So it was never a week I didn't work on it, and I just
huh.
try to keep the momentum going.
That's amazing. So, so 7 years, and does that include like, did you came to sort of like the end and then went back and revised, reworked, or did you just revise as you went? What was that process like for you?
So the first, let's say, 7 or 8 chapters got revised more times because as I was taking classes, I realized what I had done wrong and I had to go revise. So the later chapters probably went through 3 revisions, but the early chapters went through more. And so I took notes and then I laid everything out chronologically, and then I started writing the scenes. But simultaneously, I was taking classes and trying and
Mm,
reading more memoirs so that I could learn. And so that was generally the progression. And then I learned, memoir is also about reflection and takeaway, right? What did the event mean to me at the time? What do I think about it today? And so I had all those things to sort of add in and make sure that they were there so that the reader would be able to move through the story with me and would be and have access to my thoughts about it, which is important in
mm.
memoir too.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you work with an editor at any point?
So I did hire a developmental editor about 4 months before I started looking for an agent, and I was really nervous because you can't see the book after a while. You've read it so many times and you've worked it so many times, and I really had no idea what she was going to say. But the developmental editor is to look at the arc of things, to look at how the story flows and structure and all that. And she said she's been doing editing for 12 years and a lot of it's memoir, most of it's memoir. And she said it was the best one she had read. And so
Hmm.
there wasn't a lot to do after that. She gave me her feedback in April. I was looking for an agent by July. That's how little reworking I had left to do. So
Wow.
that was a great relief. It was like, phew, I don't have to spend 3 more years on this.
Well, as an editor myself, I want to also just say that if your editor gives you more notes than that, it does not mean you have failed. And that's the goal in hiring an editor or working with an editor isn't for them to say you don't need me, but that does sometimes happen, or you don't need much. Yeah. But absolutely, for listeners, don't be dissuaded if your editor has significant notes to make to offer you. It does not mean that your book won't become great. It just means that they're meeting you at a different phase of its development.
That's right. I mean, for me, it was basically 7 years in, right? I had spent a lot of time and I had done critique groups. And I had done
Hmm.
some workshops. So it's not as if I had had no input, but it was the first person who had really seen the whole structure of the book. So
Right. And
I
I think
agree. But
that access to collaborative input from people who, they're not just friends and family going to say like, "Oh, that's good," and encourage you, but they're actually going to give helpful sort of feedback. That is so crucial, whether you are working with an editor or with a writer's circle or other kind of group.
yeah, I find the critique group really useful. I mean, it's not as if you take on all of their comments. I mean, sometimes they're contradictory, right? One
Hmm.
person thinks this and the other person thinks the opposite, but it can be it can really point out things you hadn't thought about. And so always gave every piece of input careful consideration to see whether I should do
Mm.
it. And sometimes it's about trying what they suggest and seeing does it improve it or not improve it. And so all those kind of inputs and ideas. And I will say this, editing other people's work, giving them feedback is actually a learning process too. I mean, it helped
Mm.
me be a better writer by giving other members of my critique group my feedback. I learned a lot from listening to them comment on other people's pieces in the group. So
Hmm.
the critique group was a broader learning process than just getting specific feedback on my piece.
Oh, it's such a great point. So, so several months after your first meeting with the editor, you were out there looking for an agent. Tell me about that journey. How long did it take? Where did you land? How did it go?
Well, so when I started doing writing conferences, one of the things I learned about was the business side of memoir. And one of the things they really emphasized was this platform. They're going, to look for an agent because the agent's the screener for the publisher, basically, right? To look
Hmm.
for the agent and therefore the publisher, they want you to have this big platform. And I really wasn't attracted to the idea of trying to get a million Twitter followers or anything. I mean, I'm on Twitter now, but I didn't go on until after I already had the publishing deal. But I did think about things like who my audience is. I mean, I wrote a book proposal, not just the book, as you really need to do if you're going to be looking for an agent for memoir. And I had joined the boards of She Recovers and Lifering. And so that sort of helped increase my credibility on top of my long-term sobriety and the fact that I was a judge. But we used Query Tracker to look for agents, and all of the rejections that I got were all, this is a great story. These chapters are great, but she doesn't have a big enough platform. But eventually I found a really good fit for me, which was a smaller press. It's Health Communications Inc. in the recovery and self-help space. And so I was really happy with that, because I know what an uphill battle it can be to get any kind of publishing deal. And they've been really helpful with me as far as, the rollout of the book and picking the cover and all the little details of it. And so I found the agent. I started looking in July. I got no agent offers. And then I had 3 at the same time that wanted me. And that was in October. And then I signed with HCI by the end of the year. So it was relatively quick.
With who? Can you tell us again who your agency is?
The publisher is Health Communications Inc. And my agent is Anne O'Farrell.
Okay.
Anne Marie.
And what are you prepared to share, if anything? Boundaries, I respect them. But, we also, it's very illustrative and helpful for people to know the kind of nuts and bolts of the deal. What might you be prepared to tell us about your publishing deal? It's with a traditional publisher, right? This small press. So did they give you an advance? Yes. How did it go?
So, first of all, I will say that I am a lawyer, but I'm not a contracts lawyer, right? So when I got the contract, both from my agent and from the publisher, I looked at it with my lawyer's eyes, but I also used the Authors Guild to do a review of the contract and then filter their feedback and try to get the terms to be a little bit better. And I emphasize, I'm a lawyer, but lawyers don't know everything. And if you're not a lawyer, I would recommend you look. The Authors Guild will do it for free if you're a member. And it's not, they just ask you to stay a member for a year or something. So, I did get a small advance from the publisher. And then I got a tiered royalty system up to, I think it's 0 to 9,999, and then 19,999. I think I'd have to go back and look. It's been a while. And then, you get the quarterly reports now, right? And so they show me where I am, and I pretty much paid back my advance at this point. But and I will say that my amount for book, although it is shockingly low, how much to make on each book, my agent assured me, and based on my talking to my friends and talking to others, that it was actually pretty decent. But it is. I definitely understand why people choose self-publishing, where you can actually keep a much larger percentage of the money. And I thought about that. But in the traditional publishing world, I got a decent amount per book, and I did get a small advance.
I mean, it is really helpful to people. Would you be prepared to share any numbers? Do you know kind of what your royalty per copy sold amounts to?
Well, I know that, it depends on if it's ebook, paper, trade paperback, or ebook, or audio. But it's around $2 a book is what I end up keeping. So it's not, it's around $2 a book.
Yeah, that actually isn't bad at all.
Yeah,
it's actually pretty good. Sometimes it's $1.70, or under a buck is not uncommon too. So let's see. Thank you for sharing all of that about your publishing journey. I'm curious about let's talk about the emotional side of the journey. You've shared the kind of the nuts and bolts and practical steps that you took. What was it like emotionally to write this story and then also to go public with it?
Yeah, so to write it, when I got in early recovery, and for many years, I will say my trauma recovery took a lot more work and a lot more years than my substance recovery. So I was in therapy for about 10 years, different kinds, individual, and then I was in a group therapy with women who had trauma histories. So I had done a lot of work, but by the time I was writing the book, I hadn't been in therapy for about 8 years. And so it had been a while since I had really closely visited these events. And so there was that emotional reaction to some of it, especially because, as we talked about, I needed to go deep into the emotion. I really sort of need to put myself back there. What was I feeling? What was I thinking? When he swung at me, what did I do? And how did that feel? All of that. But the positive side of it was that there were some things that I had always sort of second guessed myself about decisions that I had made. Like in this rape, I made a choice that I had always, I mean, honestly, agonized over whether it was the right decision for me. And when I wrote that section of the book, it actually freed me from that. I mean,
Can you
it
give an
just,
example? What was the decision?
well, so I was basically kidnapped by three men, and there was a time where I thought, can I get out? Can I get
Mm.
away? Could I get away? And it was an agonizing choice. I mean, I was sitting there and I was weighing the factors. There's this distance between me and the door, and he's there and he's there, and there was might be a gun. I didn't see it, but they said they had, and all of these different things. It was a very agonizing choice at the time. And I decided there's no way I'm getting out of here. And if I try and fail, my death is going to be miserable. That's really what the decision I thought I was faced with. But when I wrote the book and I really went back into all of it, it just really sort of released that second guessing. It really just it reminded me, first of all, that Mary Beth in that moment had a lot more information about what was going on and the details of it than I can ever have looking back at it. I mean, it wasn't a casual decision. It was a conscious thought out
Mhm.
decision, but also, that I had done what I could to survive, and I did survive it. And so, in that sense, I probably proved that I made the right choice because I'm still here today. But it had always eaten at me about had I not tried when I could have, had I not gotten away when I could have. But I
God, that's
really
so
don't
common,
think
isn't it?
realistically it was possible.
Yeah, for victims of assault, so common to later say, wait, why, you know, why didn't I stop it? Why couldn't I stop it? Could I have stopped it if I tried it harder? And that is such a self-defeating narrative inside. So it sounds like the writing of the book also gave you back some of your self-confidence, self-compassion, and validation of your choices.
It gave me those things, and it really just reminded me, even throughout my whole history with my stepfather, and I had a violent, but all of it, I mean, I was a young girl or a young woman during all of this. I did take a lot of positive steps to try to reduce the impact of all this on me, to try to minimize the actual assaults like at home. I tried to make decisions and take actions that would help reduce the risk, but it was out of my control, and I
Mm-hmm.
knew it was out of my control. But it made me reconnect to the positive strong sides of my younger self, of what I had done to try to make things better, how I had really done my best to protect my brother and my sister because I was the oldest, and I
Mm-hmm.
viewed that as my job, right? That if someone's going to take the brunt of this, it has to be me and not them. And so, yeah, I wasn't always perfect. There were times where I antagonized him, but in reality, considering my age and what I was dealing with, I actually am proud of who I was and how I did at the time.
Yeah, and what you're describing touches on, something that we now know about the effects of trauma and how addiction develops. That so many of the things that later become maladaptive coping mechanisms were actually life preserving or sanity preserving or physical health preserving at the time, even
Right.
including substance use or extreme dissociation or other kinds of behaviors. It's like when you are powerless in a situation or you feel that you are, um, we develop ways to help ourselves survive in that moment. And then it's in later life when those coping mechanisms become a life limiting issue that we must learn to let them go.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why there's such a strong connection between trauma and substance use. I mean, based
Hmm.
on it wasn't just an individual event. I was living in a house where things were happening all the time. My odds of developing a substance use disorder were about 3 or 4 times the the general
Hmm.
average because of my circumstances. Because in the beginning, it seems to help. In the
Hmm.
beginning, I feel better. I can have more fun. I feel looser. I feel the weight lifted off my shoulder. But that's the beginning. And then it becomes a problem in and of itself. But I've
Yeah,
already developed that habit. But even when it was a problem, there was still benefit. It was still a number. Even when
sure.
I was lost control, it still had the positive benefit of numbing my emotions that could really overwhelm me. And so there is a reason why we do it, and there's a reason why it keeps going. But eventually, I wasn't in that situation anymore. I wasn't living with a violent person anymore. I wasn't living in chaos, except then it was all about the drug chaos and the drug
Yeah.
misery. That's where it ended up.
So sticking with the emotional experience of writing the book, actually, let's move on from there to the emotional experience or of sharing the book. And I want to include in that you must have made some kind of like pragmatic calculations about like, is this safe? How might it affect my career? Is it a good idea or not a good idea to be open about my history?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing it, I thought I might release it when I was working because I didn't know I was going to retire as early as I did. And so I thought about all that. But it's also about friends and family. Like they may know the general gist of things, but they don't know all the details. And then,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
one of my siblings was closer to my mother, had a different perspective on her. How is he going to feel about it? My mother was alive during most of well, no, actually, that's not true. She died right before I started. But what's the impact on the family? But then also sharing certain things that society has trouble with. Like, let's be honest, society is more accepting of alcohol use disorder than they are of shooting meth. And so that's a big disclosure. Also, some of the sexual decisions, having sex with drug dealers and things that a lot of us do can be judged by society. So I was aware that there could be not everyone was going to be happy with my story or with my explanation or how I framed it or understanding. And also that some of my family members might struggle with parts of what I was saying.
How did you navigate those decisions? Did you involve your family in those decisions, or was it an internal process for you?
I mean, I talked with my sister, who's much more an active part of the book, and make sure that she was comfortable, which I was pretty sure she would be. But I let her know what was in there. My mother had died right before I started working on the book, and then my stepfather died after I signed my deal, but before the book came out, and so I was a little worried about him. As far as the family members go, the truth is, in memoir, one of the things that they teach you is that it can't be something that you're just trying to get revenge or get back at someone. It has to be balanced. And that was one of the things I learned when I was taking classes. And so I really did my best to be fair to my mother and my stepfather and talk about some of the things that they had done that were on the more positive side to give a more balanced picture of them. But I don't think one of my siblings has read the book, and I think because even though I told him it's probably not as harsh on mom as you think it is, it still is something he's not comfortable with, and so he just hasn't read it.
And what about the when you were weighing up the career implications of coming out this way?
I mean, I was a judge. And so, I had an employer, but there really was a limit to what they would have been able to do. But I know they wouldn't have been happy. I mean, I was talking about events that were a long time ago. One of the things that made it a little easier for me is I never practiced law when I wasn't sober. Right. And so there
Mm.
isn't all that sort of ramification about did I ever commit malpractice or screw up a case or make a decision? I mean, I was sober 10 years when I became a lawyer and 20 years when I became a judge, which sort of was a little cleaner, easier
Hmm.
to deal with. But I knew that that the agency I worked for wouldn't be happy about it. But I eventually decided, you know what, I'm just going to wait until I finish it and see where things are. And it turned out that I finished it after I had already retired, and so I didn't have to deal with that. But I know a lot of people do struggle with being open in their at work, and so I sort of do feel like part of me is standing up and saying things that not everyone can say because I don't have to worry about all those professional ramifications. I have to worry about people commenting on my Wall Street Journal piece or my Philadelphia Inquirer piece and being mean and not understanding, but that's not in my immediate realm. It doesn't have an actual impact on my life.
Well, let's get into that because attacks or criticism from the public, book critics, all of that can also be really painful or something that people are so afraid of that may, in some cases, block you from even starting to write. Oh, how will I deal with negative reviews? How has that been for you, and how have you navigated it?
I mean, I will say if someone's worried about that, my suggestion would be write the book and then see where you are and worry about it later because you don't know what you're going to feel about it, several years down the line. And I will say I also changed some names and I didn't include last names in my book,
Mm-hmm.
right? So people aren't getting called out by name. And a lot of people are deceased, which is, not uncommon. But the thing about the opinion pieces, and I've had a number of them published. The thing is, the comments don't always focus on the issue, right? It's not that I expect everybody to agree with me about the issue. It's that they can get really personal attacks. They can get
Mm.
mean and nasty. And so my writing friends did caution me: don't respond to the comments.
Yeah.
which
Don't
I
engage with
which
the trolls. Do not engage
don't
with
engage with
trolls.
the trolls. It's a
Yeah.
no-win situation. It's going to suck a lot of your energy up. But I did read the comments to the first one, and after that, I'd stop. I didn't even read them because there was no point. If I thought it would have been a substantive discussion, I would have read them to learn how someone who disagrees with me thinks and what their,
Hmm.
possibly some valid points are. But that's just not mostly what the comments are. It's mostly trolls. So I never responded, and eventually I stopped reading them.
Hmm. Hmm. So it sounds like, I don't, did you have to develop was that a thick skin, or was that yeah, like your own belief in what you were doing more important to you than how it was received and perceived by others?
Yeah, I mean, it's like my Twitter feed. I am on Twitter at Mary Beth O underscore. I don't actually get in arguments with people on Twitter. I use my feed to provide information. Like, I'll share
Hmm.
new studies that come out about substance use disorder or mental health or trauma. I'll share my thoughts about recovery. I'll share opinion pieces that others have written. New ideas that are out there. And if someone comments in a negative way, mostly I just don't respond to it because I don't want to get into a debate. I'm trying to provide information. It's okay with me if not everyone agrees. I just hope that, some people will read it and maybe they'll learn something and that can help move the ball forward.
So, Mary Beth, you've talked a lot about the service aspect of writing this book, the change that you want to see in society, the support and compassion that you want to provide to people who are struggling. Um, what has this entire experience given you in terms of the gift that gives back?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, writing the book was an intellectual challenge too, right? And I love an intellectual challenge, but figuring out how to structure it and how to write it well and going through all it's that I like learning new things. I like, figuring out how to do something that I don't actually have the skills to do. And today I do a lot of speaking. I speak, on podcasts, but some television, radio, a lot of conferences and events. And I actually, that's an energizing activity for me. I like getting up and talking. I always leave Q&A time, and I like
Mhm.
engaging with the audience and having a conversation. It makes me feel like I am being of use, but also that I get to interact with people instead of being retired Mary Beth, who mostly is at home. I'm still out there engaging with society, engaging with people on the individual level, and trying to share information. So
And
it
has
does.
writing the book helped you do more of that, or brought you into new spaces that way?
Yes, I mean, writing the book has gotten me. I was speaking before the book came out, but writing the book gets me more opportunities. It is sort of a sexy title and a sexy and unusual story, and people are honestly interested. What? How they don't think somebody could actually go from shooting meth to a judge, and so that story captures attention. But then I get to talk more broadly. I mean, I spend about an hour a day reading articles and newspapers and books about recovery and substance use so that I can be well informed because I get asked all kinds of questions, a whole range of things.
Mm.
And then I do talk about writing. I have a memoir writing workshop that I do because a lot of women in recovery want to do their story. They're
You mean that
interested
you
in
do
sharing
it,
it.
as in you're leading it?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. And part of that is to help people, get comfortable writing their story and explaining sort of the parameters of what memoir is and the business side and the skills and all those kind of things. And so, it is rewarding to be able to share this with people. And I will say I talk a lot to friends and family too. And a
Mhm.
lot of friends and family are looking for guidance as to how they can help their friend or family member who's struggling with substances.
Mm.
And so it feels rewarding to be able to be of use and give them some ideas and direct them to some books and to some techniques that may help them. So all of that together is actually for me a very enjoyable way to be spending my retirement.
What an amazing, it sounds like it's been just a really overall rewarding experience for you, and one that you really have been deeply engaged in for such a long time. Um, what advice would you give to other folks who might be listening who have a painful, complicated, maybe stigmatized story to tell?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is that make sure you're emotionally ready before you start with the writing, because it will bring up feelings. It will bring up, memories that maybe you haven't thought about in a long time. So either have done the work already or maybe have access to a professional who can help you if you're surprised by the intensity of the emotions that come across as you do it. But otherwise, I think the most important thing is to just start doing it and think about what your goal is, what story you want to tell, how you structure it. If you need it, take the classes like I did. If you're worried about if you want it to be sort of written at a level that you might get published. But a lot of times people want to write their story down to share with their friends and family, right? Or leave something behind for the grandkids. It doesn't all have to be about getting a book out in the marketplace. There are a lot of reasons why people share the story.
Yeah.
And some of it can be about healing, right? That writing can be a healing technique in recovery. And so there's all kinds of good reasons to do the work. Just make sure you're emotionally ready or have access to any professional help that you might need.
Oh, such good advice. Well, Mary Beth, thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate you sharing your story, and what an interesting set of experiences indeed. The book is called Junkie to Judge. And where can they find out more about you or follow you? Tell us where to find you online.
So the book's on Amazon and all the usual sites, and your bookstores have it or can get it. I'm at Twitter. I'm at MaryBethO_, and my website is junkietojudge.com. And if anyone wants to message me, and I answer every message, you can do it through the website. And then I have other information on the site as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.